Okay, so you're the kind of person who likes to, really get to the bottom of things, right? You like to
Well,
understand things deeply and quickly, efficiently. But have you ever stopped to think that maybe that variability, that sharpness, that ability to process information quickly could could actually make you more prone to making mistakes?
it's a really interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's something that we're going to be diving into today, this idea that sometimes maybe intelligence can be a bit of a trap.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea, and it's based on this book by David Robson called "The Intelligence Trap," and it's this idea, like I was saying, this thought that maybe being really smart could actually make you more likely to make mistakes, to stumble.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? You think, oh, if I'm more intelligent, surely I'll be better at making decisions.
Yeah.
But it turns out that there's a bit more to it than that.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to be digging into today. I
Yeah.
mean, I know that we both found this book really interesting, really fascinating. Yeah.
And, the goal here is to kind of unpack this idea of the intelligence trap,
Yeah.
to look at why smart people sometimes act in ways well, maybe don't seem so smart and what we can all learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're coming at this from a variety of different angles, from the world of management science, psychology, even a little bit of history,
Yeah.
really trying to bring together these different perspectives to understand this puzzle and then to extract, some practical strategies that our listeners can use, because it turns out this is not just some abstract intellectual exercise.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this has like real implications for our lives.
Right,
Right.
absolutely.
I mean, you think about, in health and our careers, even in the legal system, the book talks about like how surprisingly common misdiagnoses are
Yeah.
in medicine. And poor judgment obviously can have a huge ripple effect in the professional world.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So understanding this trap, if you will, this intelligence trap, isn't just, about learning some cool facts. It's about making better decisions. It's about avoiding these pitfalls
Yeah.
that, can have really serious consequences.
Okay, so let's jump in. I really like this analogy that Robson uses. He says intelligence is like this really powerful engine, right? Incredible strength, amazing potential.
Right.
But what happens if that engine doesn't have the right controls? What if it doesn't have brakes or a good steering wheel or even just a good map and compass?
Imagine if you were driving a car that had all the horsepower in the world, but no steering wheel.
Yeah, no brakes.
It would be a disaster.
Yeah,
You'd be going incredibly fast,
yeah,
but with no control over where you were going.
right.
And that's kind of the analogy here with intelligence. Without those proper checks and balances, all that power can actually become a liability.
So intelligence, if I'm understanding this correctly, is the horsepower, the raw brain power, that processing speed.
Yeah.
And then what would those, crucial controls be?
So intelligence is what allows us to, learn new things, remember information, process complex ideas.
Mm.
But without these controls, what can happen is that our intelligence can actually amplify our existing biases.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So it allows us to be better at defending views that we already hold, even if those views are inaccurate.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the ability to process information.
Yeah.
It's about being able to look at that information critically and to challenge our own assumptions.
Right. Yeah. And that, it's kind of this key element that I think is so fascinating about this, right? It's this idea that intelligence can actually help you be more convincing in arguing for something that's actually not correct.
Precisely. And, the book starts off with this example of Kary Mullis, who was a Nobel Prize-winning inventor, a really brilliant mind.
Yeah, I mean, he transformed science, but he also believed in aliens.
And in AIDS denialism.
And in AIDS denialism, it's so interesting, right? It's like how can that level of genius, of scientific brilliance coexist with these viewpoints that seem to contradict a lot of evidence?
It's a puzzle. It's one of the things that really drew me to this topic. And one of the first controls that the book talks about is something called cognitive reflection.
Cognitive reflection. So what exactly is that?
So cognitive reflection is essentially the ability to stop and think, to question our gut reactions and our intuitions before we accept them as fact.
Mm.
It's about engaging that slower, more deliberative part of our thinking. It's about resisting the urge to just go with what feels right or what seems obvious at first glance.
It's almost like taking a step back and looking at your own thinking.
Exactly. And the book talks about this test, this really interesting test that was published in New Scientist magazine.
Yeah, I remember that. Wasn't that the one that a lot of Ivy League students got wrong?
Yeah. A lot of people who are considered very intelligent got tripped up by these seemingly simple questions. And what's really interesting is that the reaction to the correct answers was often disbelief. People would write in saying, no, no, that can't be right. The answer must be a mistake.
Yeah, I think the correct answers often felt so counterintuitive that people just refused to believe them.
Exactly. And that really highlights how this isn't always an easy process, even for people who are very bright. And the thing is, scoring low on these cognitive reflection tests is actually correlated with a higher likelihood of believing in misinformation, conspiracy theories, fake news, all sorts of things.
So it's not just about how fast you can process information or how much knowledge you have. It's about that critical lens, that ability to step back and evaluate what you're seeing.
Absolutely. It's about having those checks and balances in place.
Okay, so beyond this cognitive reflection, are there any other, key characteristics that can help us avoid falling into this intelligence trap?
Yeah, there are a few that work in conjunction with cognitive reflection. One is intellectual humility.
Okay, intellectual humility.
Recognizing that you don't know everything, being open to the possibility that you might be wrong. Then there's actively open-minded thinking.
Actively open-minded thinking.
Because this is about being willing to genuinely consider alternative viewpoints, fairly assessing the evidence, even if it doesn't align with what you currently believe.
Yeah.
There's simple curiosity, which is that natural desire to learn and explore.
Yeah.
Refined emotional awareness, understanding your own feelings and how they might be influencing your judgments.
Oh, okay.
And finally, a growth mindset, which is the belief that your abilities and understanding can be developed through effort and learning. So it's this combination of cognitive skills, personality traits, mindsets that really help us to navigate the world more effectively.
It's really interesting that there's now this whole field of evidence-based wisdom that's emerging. And even institutions like the Center for Practical Wisdom at the University of Chicago. It's like there's a growing recognition that wisdom is something that can be studied scientifically and cultivated.
Absolutely. And for a long time, we've kind of equated intelligence with IQ, with that raw processing power. But we're starting to realize that there's more to it than that. And a great example of this is actually from ancient Greece, the story of Socrates.
Ah, Socrates.
Yeah.
And the Oracle of Delphi, right? The one who declared that no one was wiser than Socrates.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that Socrates himself didn't believe that he was particularly wise. He was actually quite puzzled by this declaration.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of took it as a challenge, didn't he?
He did. He set out to prove the oracle wrong. So he went around Athens talking to all sorts of people who were considered to be wise, experts in their fields, politicians, poets, craftspeople.
And his big takeaway was that while they were skilled in their particular areas, they kind of assumed that their expertise extended to everything else.
Right. They would overestimate their knowledge. They thought that because they were good at one thing, they were good at everything. And Socrates saw this as a real obstacle to wisdom. He said that those who had the greatest reputations often seemed to be the most deficient in what he called good sense.
So it was actually the people who were maybe less well-known, who weren't considered these great experts, that often showed more wisdom in his view.
Exactly. And I think that's a really valuable insight for us today. It's this recognition that expertise in one area doesn't necessarily translate to wisdom in all areas.
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about this idea that intelligence isn't the be-all and end-all. And the book actually mentions some interesting things about the IQs of professionals, right?
Yeah, it talks about how if you look at certain professions like lawyers, accountants, engineers, you do see higher average IQ scores.
Yeah.
Which suggests that a certain baseline level of cognitive ability can be helpful. It can be an advantage in these fields.
Sure, I mean, makes sense.
But what's really interesting is that even within those professions, there's a wide range of IQ scores. And the relationship between IQ and how successful someone is, even when you factor in motivation, only explains a portion of the variance. It's not the whole story.
Yeah, I think the book mentions that IQ might only account for something like 29% of the difference in job performance.
Right, even when you take into account someone's drive. And David Perkins had this great quote. He said, "You often see lower IQ individuals outperforming higher IQ individuals and vice versa."
Yeah, that's so important, right? It just really highlights how IQ isn't the only factor.
Exactly. It's like the analogy of height in basketball.
Okay.
You need to be tall enough to play, but beyond a certain point, other skills like agility, strategy, teamwork become way more important.
Yeah, it's about those other factors, those more intangible things that really contribute to success.
Absolutely. And that's one of the limitations of traditional IQ tests. They only capture a very narrow slice of what it means to be intelligent.
So if we want to understand the bigger picture, how people make decisions, how they solve problems, we need to look beyond just that single number, beyond that IQ score.
Absolutely. And there have been attempts to try to define and measure these broader forms of intelligence, but it's been a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of emotional intelligence comes to mind. You know, that idea that being able to understand and manage emotions is really important.
Right. And it makes intuitive sense. But the problem is that the tests for emotional intelligence haven't really been that good at predicting things like job performance.
Right.
Much better than IQ or even just, basic personality traits.
So it's something that we intuitively know is important, but actually being able to measure it and say, okay, this person with a high EQ is going to be more successful has been tricky.
Exactly. So one way to look at these broader forms of intelligence is through Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence.
Triarchic theory.
Yeah, he basically says that intelligence isn't just one thing. It has three main parts: analytical, creative, and practical.
Okay. Analytical, creative, practical. Let's break those down.
Sure. So analytical intelligence is what we typically think of when we talk about intelligence. It's the ability to analyze information, evaluate arguments, judge different options, compare and contrast ideas. It's the kind of intelligence that's measured by standardized tests like the SAT.
Right. Yeah. So it's that kind of academic intelligence, that ability to reason logically and solve problems in a structured way.
Exactly. And then you have creative intelligence, which is the ability to invent, to imagine, to suppose, as Sternberg puts it.
Okay.
It's about coming up with new ideas, seeing things from different perspectives, thinking outside the box.
But I think Sternberg gives some really interesting examples in the book of how to encourage this kind of thinking, like asking what-if questions when you're studying history, or imagining a situation from the perspective of an animal in science class.
Yeah, those are great examples. It's about pushing yourself beyond just memorizing facts and really engaging with the material in a more imaginative way. And then we have practical intelligence.
Okay, practical intelligence.
This is about being able to use your knowledge to apply ideas in real-world situations to get things done. It's about having that street smarts.
Right. I think this is so key for understanding, why some people who are brilliant in school might struggle with basic tasks at work.
Absolutely.
Or why so many new businesses fail, even if they have a great idea. It's the implementation that's often the hurdle.
Precisely. And Sternberg has actually shown his research that teaching methods that focus on developing practical and creative intelligence can actually lead to better learning outcomes overall, even improving analytical skills. So it's not just about focusing on one type of intelligence. It's about developing all three.
And he had this really fascinating program, the Rainbow Project, where he developed an alternative college entrance exam that actually measured all three types of intelligence.
Yeah. And it turned out to be a much better predictor of college grades than the SAT alone.
So it really suggests that these other forms of intelligence, these creative and practical skills are really valuable, but they're not captured by those traditional measures of intelligence.
Exactly. There are different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching the world. And his theory helps us see that these components are largely separate from general intelligence. So you can have someone who scores very high on an IQ test, but might struggle with practical tasks or with coming up with creative solutions.
So it's not just about having a lot of horsepower, it's about knowing how to use that horsepower effectively in different contexts. Okay, so we've talked about intelligence, we've talked about different types of intelligence. Now the book brings in this other really important concept, rationality.
Right, so rationality is about our ability to make good decisions, to use the information that we have effectively to achieve our goals. It's about forming beliefs based on evidence and logic.
Right.
And, psychologists have spent a lot of time studying why we make irrational choices, why we do things that don't seem to be in our best interests. But the study of how individuals differ in their level of rationality is more recent.
Okay, so how do we measure rationality?
Well, there's this idea of a rationality quotient, or RQ.
RQ, okay.
And the key takeaway here is that IQ and RQ are not the same thing.
Right, so you can be very intelligent and still be irrational.
Exactly. And the book actually uses this term, dysrationality, to describe this mismatch, this gap between having a high IQ and displaying poor rational thinking.
And they give this really fascinating example of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. the creator of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, the epitome of the logical mind.
Right. But in real life, he was actually quite gullible, especially when it came to things like spiritual mediums.
Yeah, he was really taken in by fraudulent mediums, even though his fictional creation, Sherlock Holmes, was all about using logic and deduction to solve mysteries.
It's such a stark contrast, right? And the book gives other examples too, like the gambler's fallacy, where people who are more academically successful are actually more likely to fall for it.
Yeah, and even trained philosophers are just as susceptible to things like framing effects, which is how the way a question is phrased can influence our answers, as anyone else. So intelligence doesn't automatically protect us from these kinds of thinking errors.
So it's not just about being smart. There's something else at play here.
Right. And actually, research has found that people with higher cognitive ability sometimes show what's called a bias blind spot. They actually think they're less likely to be affected by cognitive biases than other people.
That's so interesting. It's like the smarter you are, the less you think you're susceptible to biases.
Exactly. And one theory is that because they know they're intellectually capable, they expect to do well on tasks that involve thinking. So they see bias tests as just another mental challenge that they should excel at.
And so they underestimate their own vulnerability.
Exactly. It's another example of how intelligence can actually work against us.
Yeah. So how do scientists actually measure this rationality, this RQ that we're talking about?
So there have been several tools developed to measure rationality. One example is the Comprehensive Assessment of Rational Thinking, or CART.
CART.
And this test goes beyond just looking at things like biases and heuristics, those mental shortcuts we use. It also looks at how well people understand things like probability and statistics, how they evaluate risks, and what's called contaminated mindware.
Contaminated mindware? That sounds interesting. What is that?
So contaminated mindware refers to beliefs that are not supported by evidence, things like anti-science attitudes, conspiracy theories, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And the CART has this section called the belief bias test, which is a really interesting way of measuring how good someone is at separating their logic from their beliefs.
Right. So you have to decide if a conclusion logically follows from a set of statements, regardless of whether you personally believe that conclusion to be true in the real world.
Exactly. So it's really testing your ability to think logically without being swayed by your pre-existing beliefs. Another tool that's used to measure rationality is Wendy Bruin Bruin's Adult Decision-Making Competence Scale.
Okay.
And this scale looks at things like how susceptible someone is to biases, like framing effects or the sunk cost fallacy, how well they perceive risk, how overconfident they are in their own knowledge. And what's really striking about her research is that she found that rationality scores were actually a much stronger predictor of whether people experience stressful life events than intelligence scores. Yeah, her study found that rationality was about 3 times more important than intelligence in predicting whether participants would experience negative things in their lives, things like financial difficulties or legal troubles.
So it really suggests that being a careful and rational thinker has a big impact on how our lives turn out.
Absolutely. And there's other research, too, that supports this idea. Like, for example, there have been studies that have linked higher IQ to things like increased alcohol and drug use and taking on more debt. Maybe because of, a failure to properly weigh the long-term consequences of those actions against the immediate gratification.
Right. And it kind of circles back to that idea that intelligence can sometimes be used to support our existing beliefs rather than to actually help us find the truth.
Yeah, and the book goes back to Conan Doyle in this context and suggests that maybe he wasn't thinking too little, but actually thinking too much in the wrong way.
Thinking too much in the wrong way. Okay, I like that.
Yeah, it's about this idea of motivated reasoning, which is essentially our tendency to use our thinking abilities to protect our existing beliefs and our sense of self. And this can manifest in different ways.
Okay.
One is confirmation bias.
Yeah, confirmation bias. We've all heard of that, right?
Yeah. It's our tendency to look for and favor information that supports our existing views while ignoring or downplaying information that contradicts them.
It's like we have this filter bubble around us that only lets in the information that we already agree with.
Exactly. And this bias is actually more pronounced in people who are more intelligent and more knowledgeable. They're better at finding evidence to support their existing beliefs. And it's not just about seeking out confirming information. There's also disconfirmation bias, which is our tendency to be more critical of arguments that go against our beliefs.
Right. We hold those opposing arguments to a much higher standard of proof.
Exactly. And all of this falls under the umbrella of motivated reasoning, which is essentially the idea that Our thinking is often driven by emotional needs. So our minds become self-protective, and we use our intelligence to rationalize our opinions and dismiss contrary evidence.
And the book has this great example, the study by Dan Kahn on gun control.
Oh, yes, that's a classic study.
So in this study, participants who were better at math, they were actually more likely to correctly interpret data, but only when it supported their existing political views on gun control. If the data contradicted their views, their math skills didn't help them at all.
Yeah, what's really interesting is that the most numerate individuals were actually the most likely to misinterpret the data in a way that confirmed what they already believed.
Wow, so it's not even just that they were neutral, it's that they were even more likely to get it wrong.
Right. And we see this kind of polarization across a range of issues, not just gun control. Things like vaccines, climate change, even evolution. And what's particularly concerning is something called the backfire effect.
Okay, the backfire effect.
So this is the finding that when people are presented with evidence that contradicts their beliefs, it can actually make them even more entrenched in those beliefs.
So it's like the more information they get, the more convinced they become of their original incorrect view.
Exactly. And this effect seems to be stronger in people who are more intelligent.
Mm.
So it's like their intelligence is actually working against them. The book gives that example about people's beliefs about death panels and Obamacare.
Yeah.
Even when they were shown evidence debunking those claims, it didn't change their minds. It actually reinforced those beliefs. So it's not just about a lack of information. It's about how we process that information based on our existing worldviews.
So we can't just throw more facts at people and expect them to change their minds.
Exactly. We have to understand the psychology behind belief formation. And that brings us to another really interesting point in the book. Yeah. This idea of the curse of expertise.
The curse of expertise. Okay, now, this is where things get really tricky, right?
Right.
Because we tend to think that more knowledge, more experience is always a good thing.
Right. Especially in fields like surgery or aviation, high-stakes situations. We put a lot of faith in the seasoned professionals, the experts.
Yeah. We assume they're less likely to make mistakes.
But research has actually shown that expert judgment can fail. And sometimes it fails precisely when it's most needed. And it's not just about incompetence.
What is it about then?
It's about the way expertise shapes our thinking. So the book gives this really striking example of the FBI's misidentification of Brandon Mayfield's fingerprint in the Madrid bombings.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge case.
It was a major error. You had this team of highly trained fingerprint examiners considered to be the best in the world, and they declared a 100% positive match, but they were wrong.
And the book makes this really important point that the mistakes weren't made despite their knowledge, but potentially because of it.
Exactly. So it's not just about the Dunning-Kruger effect, where incompetent people overestimate their abilities.
Right.
It's about something else, something more subtle that's happening with experts. Mm-hmm. And there was this study done in 2010 with mathematicians, historians, and athletes, and they found that these experts were actually more likely to say that they recognized fake significant figures within their field than to admit that they didn't know.
So they're more likely to pretend to know something than to say, I don't know.
Exactly. There's this pressure to appear knowledgeable, to be the expert.
Right.
And how does this relate back to the fingerprint example? Well, fingerprint matching is an incredibly complex task. It involves looking at multiple levels of detail. And expert examiners, they develop what's called semi-automatic processing, where key identification points seem to just jump out at them. But this chunking of information, while it makes them very efficient, it also makes them more vulnerable to bias.
Because they're not really processing everything consciously.
Exactly. It becomes more of a top-down process where their expectations can influence what they see.
Interesting.
And there's this research by Itil Dror that has shown that expert examiners were actually more likely to find a fingerprint match if they were told that the suspect had confessed.
Wow.
Or if they were presented with emotionally charged material, things that should be completely irrelevant to an objective analysis of the fingerprints. And if you look at the FBI emails in the Mayfield case, they showed this unwavering confidence in the match, even though there was evidence to the contrary. So it's this potential for expertise to actually create a kind of blindness to contradictory information.
It's almost like they're so focused on confirming what they already think they see that they miss those other details.
Exactly. And this curse of expertise isn't just limited to forensics. We see it in other areas as well, like aviation.
Okay.
Studies have shown that pilots' expertise can actually bias their visual perception.
Hmm.
Like, for example, they might underestimate the thickness of clouds in a storm based on what they expect to see.
Hmm.
And then, in the world of finance, after the 2008 crash, there's this really surprising finding.
Okay.
Banks that had fewer expert board members actually performed better.
Wow.
The expert members were often too invested in their existing strategies, which were often very risky, while the less experienced independent directors were actually more adaptable.
It's like they were stuck in their ways.
Yeah, they couldn't see beyond their own expertise. And similar findings have emerged in other studies looking at, local bank failures and how susceptible expert investors are to biases like the sunk cost fallacy. So it suggests that deep domain knowledge, without the right kind of critical perspective, can actually be a hindrance in some situations.
So it's not just about what you know, it's about how you think about what you know.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really interesting figure that the book talks about, Benjamin Franklin.
Ah, yes, Benjamin Franklin.
Now, Franklin is presented as someone who really exemplified wisdom, someone who seemed to be able to navigate complex situations with remarkable skill.
Yeah, he was known for his practicality, his diplomacy, his ability to find common ground.
Yeah, and the book highlights his role in the Constitutional Convention. He was often quiet during the debates, and when he did speak, it was usually to try to find a compromise.
Right, he had that famous analogy of the broad table where he said that if you're trying to fit pieces of wood together and they don't quite line up, you sometimes need to shave a little off of each piece to make a good joint.
Exactly. And he even urged the delegates to doubt their own infallibility. He recognized that even a group of very intelligent people could be swayed by their own prejudices.
Right.
And his biographer actually talks about his allergy to dogma.
I like that.
Yeah, his open-mindedness, his practical good sense, his social skills, his ability to regulate his emotions. All of these qualities allowed him to approach complex issues with a clear and balanced perspective.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't perfect, especially early in his life, but his later years were really marked by this profound wisdom.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating how these qualities that we see in Franklin align with what researchers are now studying in the field of evidence-based wisdom.
Yeah, it's almost like he intuitively understood the principles that scientists are now putting into formal frameworks.
Yeah, and this scientific study of wisdom is a distinct concept. It's actually relatively recent. It's gained momentum, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, which kind of led to a sense that maybe just being clever wasn't enough.
Right. It's not enough to just be smart.
Yeah, we need something more. And Robert Sternberg was a real champion of this field. He even incorporated aspects of wise reasoning into his college entrance exams.
Right.
And now you have researchers like Igor Grossman, who are really trying to bring the same level of rigorous scientific scrutiny to the study of wisdom that we see in fields like medicine.
What kind of things is Grossman finding?
So Grossman's research uses everyday dilemmas to study key components of wise reasoning.
Okay.
Things like intellectual humility, which is knowing what you don't know, perspective taking, which is being able to consider different viewpoints, and the ability to seek compromise.
Okay.
And he analyzes how people respond to these situations and codes their responses for the presence and quality of these elements.
And one of his most surprising findings is that intelligence, as traditionally measured, isn't actually that strongly correlated with scores on these wise reasoning tasks.
Right. And it also doesn't really predict things like happiness or good health.
Wow.
Yeah, he's found that qualities like intellectual humility and perspective taking are actually better predictors of well-being than intelligence.
So being humble and being able to see things from other people's perspectives are actually more important for a good life than just being smart.
Exactly. And it lines up with Wendy Bruin de Bruin's work showing that decision-making competence is a much better predictor of life stresses than IQ. Grossman estimates that intelligence might only explain a very small amount of the differences we see in wise reasoning, maybe like 5%. Or even less.
5%, that's really small.
Yeah, and this really reinforces the idea that there's something else going on here, something beyond just raw cognitive ability.
Yeah, and it connects back to that idea of actively open-minded thinking that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. So the question then becomes, how do we actually cultivate this wise reasoning? It's one thing to understand why it's important, but how do we actually develop these qualities in ourselves?
Yeah, how do we get better at it?
And the book makes this really important point that simply intending to be objective isn't enough. There have been studies where they've told people to try to be unbiased, but it doesn't really work.
Right. So we can't just will ourselves to be wiser. We need some actual techniques.
Exactly. We need some tools. And one tool that the book mentions is something that Benjamin Franklin called moral algebra.
Moral algebra, okay.
And this is a more deliberate process than just a quick pros and cons list. It involves actually writing down the pros and cons of a decision, assigning weights to each factor, and then taking a break before making a final judgment to allow time for more thoughtful consideration.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Franklin was actually very aware of the availability bias, which is our tendency to give more weight to information that's easily recalled. So he understood that we